Institute began as the moderator's Global Justice team 7 years ago. In 2011, 5 years into our work, we incorporated our efforts and became the Global Justice Institute with a partnership in Romania and a partnership in South Africa and relationships with activists and projects on the ground in Malaysia, China, Hong Kong, Canada, Costa Rica, Pakistan, Eastern Europe, Jamaica, Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya, and Zimbabwe. Our mission statement reads in part, to be an agent of change by building bridges that liberate and unite, voices of sacred defiance in acts of justice. And those acts of justice include economic development projects where LGBTI people see integration into the financial health of their communities and families as a key to safety and acceptance. Creating positive public images in parts of the world where the public voice is most often devoted to our demise, and theological reconciliation in a world that still largely equates being lesbian or gay or bisexual or transgender or intersex with sin and both eternal condemnation and earthly terrorization. And we have been blessed with many champions of the work of global justice. Some names perhaps you recognize, and some remain unsung heroes. Florine in Romania, and Reverend Jim in the Ukraine, and Reverend Diane Fisher all over Eastern Europe. Sharon Cox in South Africa, the Reverend Boon Lin Yo throughout Asia, a young man named Imran in Lahore, Pakistan, Reverend Robert Griffin and Devin Kamek, and Maurice Tomlinson and Reverend Tom Decker in the Caribbean, Pastor Joseph Tolton and Reverend Michael Kaminyu in Kenya, another young man named Jean-Elie in Rwanda, and Bishop Christopher and all the people of St. Paul's Reconciliation and Equality Center in Uganda, along with members of SMUG and Farouk and organizations on the ground, fighting every single day for the lives and well-being of queer people and our allies and people living with AIDS. And here in the United States, our public policy team. And there are many stories that we could tell about courage and faith under fire, and people willing to literally lay down their lives so that folks like you and me can live free of fear and safe in our own skins. But today, as is so often the case with the work of global justice, we are short on time and big on agenda. And one of the heroes in the movement for global justice is a man named Baer, who since 2009 has served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor in the State Department of the United States. Known for his work around the globe promoting democracy and human rights for some of the world's most vulnerable populations, he has become a tireless advocate for LGBTI people. Part of what we're associated with in the world, he said in a recent interview, is human rights leadership. And that means taking on the opportunities to speak up for and be a voice for the voiceless, and to advocate for equal dignity for all persons simply by virtue of their being persons. In his capacity at the State Department, he has helped to identify LGBTI advocates and organizations around the globe to connect and help assist in building capacity so that they may implement their vision for social change. Recently nominated by President Obama to become the next ambassador of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, he will become the fourth openly gay person to serve as a U.S. ambassador. He will work with 57 European, Asian, and North American countries and their leadership in the areas of security, terrorism, economic, and human rights. You know, I've had the great privilege of hearing Dan speak in several settings. And for all his accomplishments, what has always impressed me the most is his absolute accessibility and willingness to listen and help in any way he can. LGBTI people and vulnerable and marginalized peoples around the globe have a friend in Baer, and he is with us this morning to deliver our keynote address on the state of LGBTI rights around the world. Would you join me in welcoming him?
Let me start by telling you I have been oversold. That was the nicest introduction I have ever received. Thank you so much, Reverend Pat. I am so happy to be here with all of you today, and I'm very grateful to you for including me. I want to apologize that I am going to skip out of here as quickly as possible. I have a flight that leaves in an hour and 45 minutes from Baer. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'm done. I told Reverend Elder Nancy that the only thing I like less is a guy who comes late, leaves early, and gives a speech, and I'm really sorry to be that guy today, so I apologize. Over the last few years, I've come to know a number of MCC members who are not only part of a community of faith, but also part of a movement for social justice and human rights here in the United States and around the world. And I found myself over the last few weeks, whenever I mentioned this event, figuring out new ways to explain MCC's place in the diverse array of religious orders and churches that have started in America. I explained that I had come to know MCC through my work at the State Department on the human rights of LGBT persons, and that MCC leadership had been actively engaged in fostering a conversation about how best to make progress on that front. I explained that the church had been founded more than 40 years ago and had emerged as a welcoming place for the LGBT community and for others who were left out or unwelcome elsewhere. I noted, as others had noted to me, that MCC sometimes is known as the church that welcomes the marginalized. But it was only last weekend, as I sat down to write, that I thought to take a look at the mission and core tenets of the MCC. I read the mission: to tear down walls and build up hope in responding to injustice in the world. And I read the 6-point philosophy, which you all should know by heart, so I won't repeat it here. And I learned that you have a philosophy that puts human rights at the center. Human rights work is not easy, but it is the foundation for a harmonious world in which each person can, as my old boss used to say, live up to his or her God-given potential. So while MCC may be known as a church that reaches out to the marginalized, the human rights advocacy you've committed to do is not on the margins. It goes right to the heart of what is needed to build a just and peaceful world. I've been asked to talk today about the challenges to securing human rights protections for LGBT persons around the world, and I'm going to get to that. But first I want to take a moment to reflect on context. I think it is difficult for people today, particularly those of us who are lucky enough to live in rights-respecting democracies, to appreciate the tremendous historical importance of, and the arguably unprecedented success of, the political project of recognizing international human rights. Eleanor Roosevelt led the charge at the United Nations in the late 1940s to seize the moment of opportunity to channel the world's horror at the tragedies of World War II and focus on recognizing certain moral truths that were universal. She made a singular contribution to international politics and to the project of bringing about lasting peace on Earth. Her work then was premised on the truth that we are, as the Universal Declaration puts it, born free and equal in dignity and rights. And the recognition that, as President Obama would declare in Oslo 6 decades later, only a just peace based on the inherent rights and dignity of every individual can be truly lasting. I want to say a bit more about what I mean when I say that human rights has been a successful political project. Just because human rights are a true description of the obligations of governments and the rights of individuals doesn't mean that they have purchase on the way the world is run or the way that individuals experience their lives. Being true is the right place to start, but it isn't enough. In order to have human rights affect policies and practices of governance, human rights have to become part of how we think about governance. They have to become part of how we diagnose and talk about problems facing people, how we strategize about fixing them, and how we measure success. And they have to become part of the laws by which power and authority are administered and restrained. As Americans, we have a powerful example in our national history. Our own political project of building a country and a nation was grounded in an articulation of principles that found their echoes in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights more than a century and a half later. And our project of becoming a more perfect union has been made possible and sustained by a politics that draws upon, refers back to, and is defined by a commitment to a set of principles about the rights of individuals. No step forward in our shared political project has been an accident. Each step forward has come because we have mustered the strength to attain a better representation of the principles recognized at our founding. We know that today work remains. We know from our history that progress is not linear. Last week we were reminded of this by the one step back on Tuesday, followed by 2 steps forward on Wednesday. But the story of America has been one of principles as destiny, and it will continue to be that way for as long as we as a people continue to work for that more perfect union. Now, looking around the world today, from the unconscionable bloodshed in Syria, the prison camps of North Korea, the ongoing torture and disappearances in Iran, to the persistent lack of democracy and denial of fundamental freedoms in China, Cuba, and Vietnam, to the victims of sexual and gender-based violence in the eastern Congo, where people have suffered decades of conflict, to crackdowns on NGOs and independent media in Egypt, Russia, Ecuador, Azerbaijan, and elsewhere. It might seem strange to say that Eleanor Roosevelt and the colleagues she worked with from a host of other governments have been successful. There are many hundreds of millions of people who are living lives without the ability to exercise their human rights and fundamental freedoms. So it should be clear that when I say that the political project of human rights has been successful, I don't mean that the work is over or that human rights are now secure around the world. But when you think about the fact that it's been less than 70 years since universal human rights were first formally recognized by the international community, and that today there exists a range of international legal instruments and documents that articulate the obligations of states, when you think that a number of countries have incorporated aspects of international human rights law into domestic law, when you think that many countries have created institutions charged with monitoring human rights domestically, when you think that the international community has, both through the UN and a number of regional institutions, come to recognize that human rights are central to maintaining peace and security, when you think that the language of human rights is routinely used to assess government failures and to defend the work of activists and advocates making the case for change, when you think that even governments that routinely violate human rights often make attempts to defend themselves using the language of human rights, thereby implicitly conceding the legitimacy of the basis for claims against them. And when you think that there are now a number of courts at the domestic and international level that have prosecuted people guilty of human rights violations and abuses, when you think about the policy conversations about a range of global challenges from economic development to human trafficking to gender equality that now inevitably include human rights. And after all this, when you think about the fact that when my own father was born, at the beginning of 1948, just 2 generations ago, none of these or any of the many other ways in which human rights has become part of how the world thinks, interacts, justifies actions, none of these was real. It is clear that we have come a long, long way in a short amount of time. And the reason I say all of this is because when I tell people I work on human rights for the US government, sometimes people say, wow, that must be so depressing. And while it is true that human rights violations and the denial of human dignity that they entail are indeed too widespread, too frequent, and too devastatingly sad to describe fully, it is also true that the possibility for progress is undeniably there. Eleanor Roosevelt and the many others who have come after her have bequeathed us a living project and the potential to have a lasting positive impact on the world. Human rights are the world's long-term strategy. And so I'm not depressed to be the human rights guy. I feel lucky and humbled to be part of a constellation of actors in countries around the world, most of whom make time for human rights work after long hours in a factory or taking care of children, or both, who are making the case, often at great personal risk, in town halls and in courtrooms and in churches, on blogs and op-ed pages, in parliaments and justice ministries for the kinds of changes that will bring about a world that more fully embraces the dignity of every person. I feel lucky to be part of a common project with all of them. The only thing I'm depressed about is not having enough time in the day. I also feel fortunate to be working for the United States government. Throughout Democratic and Republican administrations, our leaders have understood that the United States must play a leadership role in advancing human rights around the world. That means, among other things, supporting those advocates and activists on the front lines, speaking out about human rights violations and abuses, embracing the fact that universal principles apply to everyone, including ourselves, and that, as former President Clinton has said, the power of our example is more powerful than the example of our power. Human rights leadership also means calling attention to gaps, to those who have been left out or marginalized in the past, and to working to make good on the promise that human rights are the birthright of every person. This is some of the hardest work, because most often those who have been marginalized, the most vulnerable people in societies, aren't marginalized by accident. They're marginalized on purpose. And popular opinion among dominant groups often supports discrimination and stigma. Whether you're talking about protecting members of religious minorities or a minority ethnic group, women or LGBT persons, it's not just the building up of protections and laws and institutions that is needed, it's often the countering of public perception that these individuals count less or are less deserving of universal human rights. Reinforcing the universality of human rights protections, that you can't pick and choose who gets them and still call them universal. This is the context for the Obama administration's efforts to advance human rights protections for LGBT people as part of our broader human rights foreign policy. And while, of course, this effort is relevant to LGBT persons around the world, it's also a continuation of a long tradition of American leadership on human rights, of being a voice for the voiceless. As President Reagan, you didn't think I was going to quote him, as President Reagan said more than 25 years ago, the violation of human rights, whether in Kampuchea or Paraguay, Afghanistan or North Korea, or the murder of Baha'is in Iran, is the rightful cause of all free people. Today, that's our job, our duty. America must continue to be a beacon of hope, sending this message to the oppressed of all nations. Those who suffer for freedom are not alone. We think of them and we are with them. Let me take a few minutes to talk about some of the key challenges to protecting human rights for LGBT people around the world, and then say a little bit more about what we're doing to work with others to respond to them. The conversation has to start with the horrifying prevalence of violence, sadly, also of killings of LGBT persons, because of who they are and whom they love. As we've been reminded by recent news coverage of hate crimes motivated by animus towards LGBT persons in New York and elsewhere in the US, this is a problem we have here at home, too. And around the world, thousands of individuals are victims of violent attacks based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. In some countries, governments have taken the first step toward finding solutions by tracking these acts of violence and reporting on them. But in many more, there are no reliable statistics, only far too frequent reports of individual incidents. Trans people are often at heightened risk. The Trans Murder Monitoring Project documented the killings, often in brutal fashion, of 265 trans people around the world in the 12 months ending in November 2012. In addition to violence, bad laws continue to rob LGBT persons of the protections to which they are entitled. Over 70 countries still criminalize consensual sexual conduct between adults of the same sex. Many of the leaders of these countries defend these laws, saying they are necessary to protect against the importation of homosexuality, which they depict as a Western invention. There's a peculiar irony to this, since the majority of these laws are relics of colonialism that are left on the books. Others defend these laws by pointing out the fact that they are rarely enforced. But this overlooks the fact that the threat of enforcement leaves LGBT persons, and indeed anyone who could be accused of being gay, vulnerable to blackmail and exploitation and afraid to reach out to authorities when they are victims of crime. And furthermore, even when they are not enforced, laws are signposts to citizens. They have a teaching effect because they reflect a country's public values. Laws that criminalize people for who they are send a message to the population writ large that these people are worthy of stigma and discrimination and create the kind of environment where violence is more likely to be tolerated. In addition to bad old laws, we're now seeing a rash of bad new laws. Broadly speaking, these laws target LGBT persons by curbing freedom of expression or freedom of association and peaceful assembly. Some come under the heading of criminalizing gay propaganda and making it illegal to talk about and therefore to advocate for greater acceptance of LGBT persons. Russia recently adopted a version of such a law. Others limit the freedom of association and assembly by barring NGOs that work on LGBT issues or banning pride marches. These laws run counter to universal human rights, and they impair the rights not only of LGBT people, but of all people in the countries in which they've been put in place. A third set of challenges has to do with the tools to push back against violence, discrimination, and unjust laws. Civil society is increasingly under threat around the world. More than 50 countries have passed new laws aimed at restricting the activities of civil society organizations in the last 5 years alone. In many cases, entrenched regimes that have accorded power to a corrupt few are taking aim at critics and trying to silence voices of citizens who would hold them accountable. Organizations that work on protecting LGBT people are often even more imperiled, and their members more likely to be subject to violations of their fundamental freedoms. Moreover, in places where there's an overriding societal discrimination, LGBT groups are often ostracized by others in civil society. In addition to these challenges, and of course deeply connected to them, is the challenge of getting good facts to highlight the problems that LGBT persons face and to advocate for the remedies that are necessary. One of civil society's greatest tools in holding governments accountable is documenting violations and abuses and engaging in public advocacy for remedies. Advocates also need to be able to share facts that counter some common myths that are propagated by those who wish to reinforce stigma and discrimination. Myths like the ridiculous notion that sexual orientation is contagious, or that people can be recruited to be gay. These scare tactics are best countered with the scientific research that shows them to be nothing more than lies perpetuated by hate. Of course, the problems I've highlighted today, violence and bad laws and challenges for human rights defenders, are interrelated, and the United States, at the direction of President Obama and Secretary Kerry, is working to address them in a variety of ways around the world. Ambassadors and their teams at embassies and consulates around the world are having tough conversations with host governments, making clear our concerns about human rights violations and abuses when they occur, and encouraging leaders to stand on the side of universal human rights, even when it's unpopular. We talk to government ministers and presidents, to police chiefs and mayors, and we point out that protections of human rights mean protections for everyone. No excuses, no exceptions. And our foreign assistance professionals and diplomats spend a lot of time meeting with civil society actors in their host countries, getting to know them and the challenges they face so that we can support them in the most effective ways possible. We're using our relationships to build bridges between local civil society and government representatives. For example, in one country in sub-Saharan Africa, our ambassador introduced local LGBT advocates to the country's top police official and facilitated their first interaction and discussion, which to everyone's surprise was positive. As a result, the local LGBT organization now has a direct communication line to the police should they need to reach out, and they often do. We also publicly support LGBT persons and organizations. Our embassies and consulates around the world host International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia and Pride events. Our ambassadors march in pride parades, write op-eds, and make public statements advocating for the human rights of LGBT individuals. Already this year, we've seen events and celebrations in every region of the world. Our ambassador to the Czech Republic and his family opened their home in honor of Idaho, bringing together local LGBT leaders to join in a discussion over dinner with U.S. LGBT leaders. Our ambassador to the Philippines joined acclaimed television personality and LGBT advocate Boy Abunda in creating an It Gets Better video to take a stand against all forms of bullying. In Tel Aviv, the ambassador and approximately 50 embassy staff members marched in the city's Pride Parade along with members of the Canadian, Dutch, Spanish, British, and French embassies. The group wore t-shirts with Pride printed in English, Hebrew, and Arabic on it. In some places, our embassies serve as safe spaces for LGBT individuals and activists to come together and discuss common challenges and strategize about solutions. Embassy Port-au-Prince in Haiti hosted its first Idaho event this year, a screening and discussion of the documentary film Des Hommes et Dieux, of Men and Gods, which explores issues of homosexuality, religion, culture, discrimination, and acceptance in Haitian society. More than 100 people attended from LGBT advocacy organizations and the diplomatic community. And in Rwanda, members of LGBT community groups, the diplomatic corps, local non-government organizations, and several senior Rwandan government officials attended an Idaho reception at the U.S. Embassy. We've also worked in the multilateral system at the UN and in regional organizations to reinforce the fact that human rights are the entitlement of LGBT persons just as they are the entitlement of any other person, and that governments must uphold their international human rights obligations. We supported South Africa's resolution at the Human Rights Council 2 years ago that was the first ever UN resolution to recognize, as former Secretary Clinton put it, that gay rights are human rights and human rights are human rights. We supported the creation of a special rapporteur in the Organization of American States who can monitor abuses and offer expert advice in this hemisphere. And we support the calls from UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Navi Pillay earlier this year for the UN to institutionalize its work on human rights for LGBT persons, including through regular reporting. We have invested in supporting NGOs and activists who are working to make the case for change in the societies in which they live. We've reached out to other governments, including Norway, the Netherlands, France, Germany, and Finland, and to private sector actors to help support the Global Equality Fund. And we're putting resources to work in 25 countries around the world through grants to civil society organizations that will help them build their capacity, work together, leverage strategic litigation and advocacy campaigns, and document and report on human rights abuses. With this support, we're also able to fund new innovative initiatives to protect transgender persons from violence, as well as educate and train judges on international human rights obligations as they relate to LGBT individuals, with the hope that their decisions enhance protections and advance equality. Our embassies and consulates play a critical role. Through their contacts with civil society, we are able to channel resources to emerging local organizations in remote corners of the world. In one project, we're assisting a local group to formally register as an organization. Sounds simple, but it's crucially important so that they can do things like open their own bank account. In another project, we're providing funds for an emergency shelter for LGBT individuals who are rejected by their community. We review many, many more strong applications than we can support ourselves. Hence, our hope is to grow the fund with the help of like-minded corporations, foundations, and governments. As part of the fund, we've also created a special emergency initiative with international NGOs from around the world so that when an advocate gets in trouble, and they often do, we can throw them a lifeline of support, whether that means paying for a doctor or a lawyer, or helping them relocate temporarily to get out of harm's way. And we've enhanced our own factual reporting. The United States State Department publishes human rights reports every year on every country around the world. These reports are seen as the gold standard of comprehensive and objective reporting, and every country's report now has a section on human rights practices as they relate to LGBT persons. These reports help validate the claims of local advocates. There are a lot of good news stories out there, like the fact that in Vietnam, several NGOs have worked together to reach out to journalists and help educate them about LGBT issues, and then to the government to offer input on legal revisions that, if they succeed, will bring LGBT persons closer to equality under Vietnamese laws. In Belize, where criminalization of consensual same-sex behavior still exists, the First Lady has taken a courageous stand, calling for a review and legal reform, and the government stood up to criticism against including sexual orientation in its revised national gender policy. In Uganda, where a lot of international attention has focused on the anti-homosexuality bill, there has emerged a civil society coalition that includes more than 50 groups, some of them LGBT-focused, some not, who oppose the bill and who have been working together, creating a model for coalition building here in Washington. Sneak preview, it is your great privilege to get to hear from a member of that coalition later today, and a good friend of mine. In Montenegro, the government recently developed a national action plan to combat homophobia and transphobia, an important step forward in a region where intolerance toward LGBT persons is prevalent. In Chile, following the gruesome killing of a gay man in a hate crime last year, the government responded to tragedy with resolve, and legislators worked to pass a new law that boosts penalties for those accused of hate crimes. People sometimes ask me if things are getting worse, not better. They see reports of violence or outrageous statements by politicians using anti-LGBT rhetoric as a populist issue in campaigns, often to distract from corruption or other failures of leadership. They hear about attacks in places that they didn't used to have reports of attacks in. I subscribe to the Gandhi theory of change. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. So, when we hear about abuses and violations in new places, this is both intolerable and perhaps a sign that discussions and the start of a reckoning are happening, that the time of ignoring has come to an end. We may not be able to change the fact that the night is always darkest before the dawn, but we can work to hasten that dawn and be ready to greet the morning when it comes. Thank you all so very much.